So without further ado, I'm Dr. Craig Weiner, and welcome to Whidbey Island and the Transformational Dialogues. Is anybody not from Whidbey Island? Everybody has a connection to Whidbey. All right, including Mark. So my guest tonight is Mark Brady, Dr. Mark Brady, who is a friend, a colleague, a wonderful, colorful sock wearer. He's worked as a contractor, as a neuropsychologist, as a researcher, as an academician, as a teacher, as a lecturer extraordinaire, and there's not a time that I don't get together with Mark and learn something, either about myself or about the way the brain works, or the possibility of the mind, and also a friendship, and to have another friend.
A dangerous friend.
That is a dangerous, we're going to talk about dangerous friends that influence me, and you'd be amongst them. So I think we'll talk a little bit about your history so people know a little bit about you, and then we'll move into how friends really change your mind. So,
okay.
All right. Now the fun question is always the very first one, because I never prepare for it, and it's always interesting to see what comes out. Okay. So, how
I knew you were going to ask that.
You did. So you have spent a lot of time using your hands.
I have.
As a contractor, builder, doing a lot of physical labor and joy in that.
Yeah.
How does that possibly tie in with being fascinated with the way the brain and mind work? One would think that those are kind of polar extremes, not necessarily, but could you broach those two diverse interests of yours? Is there a theme there?
Now, I knew you were going to ask that, so I brought my tool belt. It's a really complicated question, actually, but I can try to take you through it. So, Craig and I just went to a presentation called ACEs, put on by the county, and ACEs are a program that was developed by Kaiser that they discovered that adverse childhood experiences profoundly impact health and well-being all through the lifespan, and people showing up at Kaiser Permanente Hospital for treatment have extensive adverse childhood experiences, right? So I was one of those kids that had adverse childhood experiences. There's 9 of them. And if I look over the list, I probably have 7 of them, right? So basically they end up oftentimes stored in the brain as traumatic memories, right? And so I really struggled, both in school, socially. I mean, I can tell you that it's the grace of God that I'm not in prison now.
There's still time.
I can tell you one story where I thought it was a good idea to hunt squirrels in a public park, and my mother thought it was a good idea to give me a gun at age 14. And so I come over this rise, and I have this gun. And when I reach the top of the rise, I look down, and there's 12 New Haven cops with their guns out coming up the hill. And it's like, you're a kid, you don't really think too much about that. But if I had done anything threatening at all, I have no doubt that one of those 12 guys probably would have shot. I grew up in a housing project, and you needed to be constantly vigilant about your environment if you were going to survive. And so, growing up in a housing project, you need to be using your hands a lot. I barely graduated high school. I skipped essentially senior year and spent it at the library researching how to be a moonshiner. Because
I always learn something new about your work every day.
I didn't have any money and needed to find a way to make money. Didn't even apply to college. It just seemed too far. No one ever gave me any guidance about it. Didn't even know that you could apply for scholarships. And then as soon as I turned 18, I moved out of the projects and moved to California. I just went around to all my friends, I borrowed $150, and I was gone. So changing the environment profoundly changed what was going on in my brain and in my body. And by happenstance, I happened to go into this business with a friend, and we had extra space in our building, and we rented the space to a framing contractor in California. And I just like the tools. Framing contractors don't frame with hammers, they frame with rigging axes. So you're walking around with these double pouches and this rigging axe, and you're, all day long, you're just a lot of physical movement. But what I didn't realize is that because I grew up with these adverse childhood experiences, what saved my life basically was this physical movement. If I had just gone straight into college, tried to do the work, and just focused in the mental sphere, I would have had a lot of problems, a lot of trouble.
It's funny because I also went from the East Coast to California and literally I went to college first, but the need to get my hands dirty. I worked with a tree worker, I worked with gardening, I worked with landscaping, we were climbing and doing brush, and there was really that very strong need around the same time in my early 20s of really just doing that kind of physical, manual, non-intellectual labor for a period of time.
So it's like an intuitive impulse?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it turned out it was good that I didn't stay in that, because the guys who were, I was young, and I didn't realize that framing contractors in Southern California are a front for drug distribution. And these guys are massively trafficking cocaine and amphetamines and stuff. And I'd go out on the job, and they'd just be banging away, and just, framing whole houses in a day. And it's like, man, I just can't keep up with these guys.
Speed.
Yeah.
Okay, that helps.
So the physical part is actually an integral and necessary part, at least for somebody with adverse childhood experiences, to bring some kind of balance to embodied trauma.
At least when I grew up, there was a parental wisdom that your peers were important, because it was almost like, in a childhood-like way, bad kids had cooties, and you didn't want your kids to be with the kids that had cooties, because that would influence you and that might steer you in the wrong direction. And I think it really is understandable that if our kids hang out with kids that are into drugs, or kids that are violent, or kids that are into things that we might determine aren't appropriate behaviors, that they, especially at a young age, could influence. And I think that's pretty accepted.
But the reverse is also true.
That's what I was just going to speak to. So on one hand, but we don't speak to the altruistic behavior, possibly your good kid could influence them.
Yeah.
But beyond that, other than affecting behavior, are you saying that somehow the people we associate with and other points of view literally affect not only our thoughts and possibly our choices, but actually the physical brain as well?
Absolutely.
And could you maybe speak to that process?
So I think if any of you had a chance to read the description that Craig and I printed up for it, this dialogue, neuroscience is huge. I mean, it is like into everything, from theology to ethics to economics, and it's only getting bigger. So what the field is having to do is both converge and diverge at the same time, right? So there's a field called Interpersonal Neurobiology, which is basically the brainchild of a psychiatrist at UCLA named Dan Siegel. And I first read Dan's book, The Developing Mind, I guess it was in 2005 and stuff. And I happened to have a position that I made for myself at a think tank at Stanford, and I was the maintenance man. But it was the only way that I could get to this place, because it's a really prestigious place where Nobel scholars go and spend their, year or 2 years writing up their research and stuff. So I was there for 10 years, and I was able to take advantage of my position there because my email would go out and say, CSBS at Stanford. And so when I would find people whose work I was interested in, I would invite them to come up and be a presenter at this prestigious think tank. So I got to meet a lot of these really wonderful people whose work I admired and wanted to learn more about. So Dan Siegel was one. So one day I picked Dan up. He was giving a presentation in San Francisco with Spirit Rock, Jack Cornfield. And I chauffeured him around the Bay Area for the whole day, and I got to pick his brain about, what inspired you to become an interpersonal neurobiologist. And he has a similar story. He took a year off from Harvard's medical school because he thought psychiatrists were crazy, and he became a fisherman. Right? And in the course of this sort of distancing himself from the field, he was essentially an attachment researcher. And for those of you who don't know what attachment researchers do, they just study babies and mothers and relationships between babies and mothers, essentially. And so with that background, and then going into psychiatric practice, he began to put some pieces of the puzzle together about essentially how adverse childhood experiences begin to influence and shape a developing brain. And it turns out that one of the powerful shapers of baby's brain is mother's voice. Because mother's voice is the novel stimulus that babies continually are exposed to, as opposed to, say, the sounds of digestion or respiration, right? So they're tuning into mother's voice, and it turns out that the sound of mother's voice is a powerful neurological driver. Begins to organize baby's brain in utero. And it also turns out that baby's brain does not grow uniformly left and right together. It always starts out on one side, usually the right, or the non-language side of the brain. And then as language begins to come online, the left side then begins to sort of catch up to the right. But that alternating pattern of development, we know continues at least through age 12. My suspicion is, if I look at my own life, how I've wandered back and forth through different interests and discipline, it probably goes on through our whole lives. If we allow it, if we are aware of it and are able to honor the impulses. Right? So, there was a question, and I've forgotten exactly what it was.
We haven't gotten to memory yet.
How friends influence the brain. So Dan was interested in attachment research, and what he discovered is that mom and early connection experiences do profoundly, wirelessly connect neurology.
First Wi-Fi system.
Yeah, absolutely. And other people for the rest of our life. There's really a set of lovely experiments where teacher goes into a classroom and stands in front of the class for 2 minutes and then walks out. Researchers come in and they pass around a piece of paper and say, tell us on a scale of 1 to 10 how well you think you're going to like this class and this professor. This is after 2 minutes, probably could be less, but so they fill it out, and then they take the class is over, the researchers come back and they ask the same question again. And it turns out there's almost a perfect correlation where within 2 minutes of walking in the room, people know if they're going to enjoy the class or enjoy the professor. So all of you knew, before we even started, how you were gonna like this talk.
But we'll ask later. Don't want to disappoint you. So, like a precognition or a Malcolm Gladwell blink-like knowing that you kind of a download of information.
It's probably a
In the beginning?
non-verbal, somatic, right brain knowing, if you're paying attention, and if it matters.
So so then do we know whether friends from the very beginning are going to turn out to be good friends, how they're going to influence us? We have some preconceptions about how that turns out?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Okay. I'm just tying it back to that early knowing, back to how friends shape our brains. I was trying for a segue.
So, a good segue. So we're talking about dangerous friends here. And I borrowed the term dangerous friends from Zen Buddhism. And basically a teacher, a Zen teacher, is what they call a dangerous friend. And because what he's trying to do is guide you on a path to what I feel is more whole, balanced integration. In other words, the way I think about the brain is as this collection of endocrine glands that secrete thoughts and process energy information. So the more energy and information our brains can process, the more awareness we can have, okay? So there is a slide that I want to show you here. It's this one, I think. No, it's this one.
One more T.
It's that one. So this is Tim Wilson at the University of Virginia, and he wrote a book called Strangers to Ourselves. And essentially what they have determined is that in this moment, right now, all of us, through our 5 senses, are processing roughly 11 million pieces of information. Right? That's a lot. However,
Per second.
Per moment.
per moment. Yeah. So we've just done like, I don't know, 55 million pieces, right? And it's really interesting if you do a little research of how they computed this number. It's not just pulled out of a hat. You know, it's what they did is they looked at receptor cells going to different sensory organs, and then he did a compilation and came up with a number. The interesting piece is that we only consciously are aware of about 40 pieces of that information. So 40 out of 11 million, right? So what that is essentially saying is that there's this whole process going on that's guiding each of our lives that is totally unconscious. And isn't it extraordinary that we're alive and well, relatively speaking?
Yeah.
So we haven't managed to create total havoc and destroy ourselves in the world.
That's why walking and chewing gum at the same time must be so difficult.
Partly why, absolutely. So what I think a dangerous friend does is what they're able to maybe expand that 40 pieces of information to maybe 45 in any moment, right? And I think that's a lot.
Hence dangerous because?
And it's dangerous, okay, another complicated question. So, growing up in a housing project, what I was aware of is that this is a dangerous place, and I needed to really be hypervigilant if I was going to survive. And that's what the brain is really designed to do, to keep us alive, right? And it turns out that traumatic experiences, and I can give you an example of one right now. I grew up with my older sister as the primary caretaker. My mother was an alcoholic, mostly bedridden. And in the projects, you know, you get together with the kids that weren't dangerous, and you do things like play stickball and tag and other stuff. And so one evening I was playing stickball, and my sister wanted me to come into the house and have dinner. And I wasn't into that. So she called me and called me and called me, and then I wouldn't come, so she came out and started to chase me. And just as she started to chase me, my friend, Junior Jackson, grabbed me and held me so that she could catch me. So this is a betrayal. And then she got me, and she just started hitting me. I can still feel the area in the back, right below the skull area, where she hit me about 4 or 5 times, right? So that's stored in the right brain. And it stays there. The important piece is that I couldn't get away.
How old were you when that happened?
About 9, 8 or 9. I couldn't get away. And so when we're stuck and we can't get away,
Helplessness.
pardon?
The sense of helplessness.
Yeah, exactly, helping. So there's a distinction between a traumatic experience and an experience that has a high probability of resulting in post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's the inability to escape. Because when you can't escape, what happens is the brain has to take over for what escape would have allowed you. And what it does, and I have pictures, but we won't go to them, where it just shows these inhibitor neurons attaching on to the neurons firing in response to this event and shutting them off and keeping them from firing. But it's essentially then taking all the 11 million components of that experience and shutting them off and encapsulating them in something that my friend Bob Scare, who's a neurologist, called a trauma capsule. So we have a finite amount of processing capacity in our brains. If a lot of it is taken up with trauma capsules that aren't firing, then we've got a problem. Right? It's like being on a freeway where there's a one pileup after another. You can't really process energy and information very effectively. So the brain knows this. And so what Freud recognized really early on is that there's this thing called the repetition compulsion, where we continually put ourselves in similar situations, similar circumstances, and try to recreate the original trauma so that we can not get stuck this time, but can actually take some kind of triumphant or evasive action. And then the neurons can keep firing, and you can peak and come back to homeostasis, and get that collection of neurons that were inhibited back online and part of the collective network again. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that answer the question somewhat?
Several of them. Oh, that's
It's a fascinating process.
Mm.
So, I mean, when I was first learning to be a framing contractor with this big rigging axe, and rigging axes are heavy, because what you want to do is you want to be able to set the nail and pound it all the way in with one hit, right? Well, one day I pounded the wrong nail.
a thumbnail.
Yeah, and so invariably, when you do that with any kind of hammer, the probability of you doing it again very soon is really high. And it's for that very reason, the compulsion to repeat the trauma. In an attempt to actually heal it, but you end up doing more damage. And it happens in relationships all the time, where you're repeating things over and over and over and over. Did you have a question?
Yeah, is this capsule an actual physical entity, location, or is it
It is actually.
conceptual?
It is. I mean, you can. There's a project on the internet called the Blue Brain Project. You can actually go in and see electron microscope photos of pyramidal neurons sitting in your skull, and then these white inhibitor neurons attached to them, keeping them from being able to fire.
So you don't release that emotion because it's inhibited.
It's inhibited, so it can't.
You can't release it.
It's taken out of the network. Oftentimes for many, many years. Like, I was like 55 before I ever realized that I was somebody who suffered panic attacks. Like, how can I have all these degrees and be exposed to all this learning and not know that oh, when they're talking about panic attack, they're talking about something that I experience all the time.
It, Robert Scare's work is very powerful. I've gotten to witness it through some of the matrix reimprinting work that Lena does, and what I've really seen and watched, and in that work is described, literally this trauma happens, and it's almost like we cleave off that aspect. So there's a cleaving off of who we are in that experience that literally can sit there in that same state with those same emotions at that same age and those same responses, and that stays alive, almost like a separate entity within us, for often the rest of our lifetime.
Years and years and years and years.
Decades and decades. So all of a sudden something later in life triggers a memory, a smell, somehow it gets back to that connection, to that cleaved off piece, and all of a sudden we're feeling the emotions that we felt when we were 6.
You see.
And the same rage, and the same anger, and the same whatever that is, and that part of us that then acts as the 6-year-old or the 12-year-old or the angry 14-year-old or whatever, comes up, and the coming up, when it comes back up and it gets expressed, what's happening then? It's not necessarily healing. The re-experiencing
Right.
doesn't necessarily change that.
Absolutely not.
It's just simply a replaying.
Right.
Would that be accurate?
That's accurate in my experience. So let me just go back a little bit. So we have this capsule, and I was going to show you a picture of an artist's rendition. Think of it as like a ball of yarn, but of not just a continuous string, but a bunch of little strings of yarn, right? And those are all neurons, and they're all representing the experience. So the example I gave you, my sister hitting me, so there's neurons in there that felt the pain of the slap. There's neurons in there that felt this. There's neurons in there that felt the surge of adrenaline when I realized that my friend had betrayed me and was holding me. There's what my eyes saw, what my nose smelled, the perspiration. All that stuff is collected in this capsule, right? So now, all it takes is for somebody like to grab my arm, the same way Junior Jackson grabbed my arm, and that neuron in the capsule now begins firing. And then there's a process called kindling. And so once that neuron starts firing, then it sort of starts everything else, it pulls the inhibitor neurons off the things in the capsule, and you're in a full-blown panic attack response. Now, how do we actually get it so that it's just not simply a reenactment, but rather a healing event?
Good question.
That's a good question.
I should have asked.
Why not? Why don't you answer it? Because I think you can. Because EFT does.
So, the discussion, when we go to that, because who hasn't had some traumatic event? And remember that on one hand, just to clarify that, and please correct me, is, on one hand, sexual violence would certainly be a traumatic event that everybody would agree to and point to, especially to a child. But you might not have called, let's just say the friend just held your arm and your sister yelled at you
Right.
and didn't actually strike you. You may not have called that a traumatic event. It was your friend grabbed your arm, so what? But to that child at that time, that included seeing the sister and being betrayed and having all those things, was a traumatic event, possibly to this child.
And it makes you susceptible now.
And
So,
hold on one second, and I'll get right to you. So that susceptibility to other associated, similar, like events in his perception, a hand holding, a way the face looked, the weather at the time that you hear an angry voice, all those things that got together. So somehow we have to find ways that are being explored, EFT or otherwise, to go back into that event and to be able to release and bring that adult mindset to that place that then somehow recovers a sense of safety to neutralize that experience. And that, I think we're all trying from different ways, energetically, psychotherapeutically, etc., to burst that bubble and to open up that yarn of neurons so they don't get easily re-triggered.
Yeah. And he's right. We are in the process of learning a lot about how to effectively reintegrate and bring traumatic experiences to fuller resolution.
So something you just said triggers something in me, which is there a certain level of subjectivity to a traumatic event? Because
All subjects.
so in other words, if your sister was a tease and you knew when she was grabbing you, or you thought she was teasing you rather than doing it seriously, maybe you wouldn't have reacted as it being a traumatic event. Maybe it would have been a silly thing to you. Is that true?
It's 100% subjective in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's another slide I have I'm not going to show you, but it's a brain with a fingerprint over it. And the implication is that every single one of us, our brains are more unique than our fingerprint. And that's a problem for education that is just, needs a lot of work.
Somewhat difficult for.
Actually, I'm going to hold on and then I'll get to
I wonder if, you know, in re-looking at that, you didn't feel guilt as a child that you were making your sister come out and grab you to bring you into the house to help make her life easier by feeding you or whatever. I mean, that's a different way of looking at it too.
That could have been someone else's experience, absolutely.
Or
It wasn't mine, but it could have been, absolutely. Yeah.
Tim.
Dan.
Somebody else. I'm sorry, I get Tim.
Oh.
My memory of my experience of this type of thing is that I was the fourth of four boys with a domineering father. And the experience of being hopeless or helpless existed daily.
Tim, I'm going to repeat back just because you're speaking at me for
Right.
the camera, if that's all right. So you're the fourth of four boys,
Right.
Youngest.
the youngest.
Young.
Okay. And you had on a daily level that kind of emotional traumatic insults, if I might add, on some level.
Yeah. And they weren't always physical, but they were certainly at that point where I was the smallest, the least experienced, the most vulnerable. And so the question I have in here after that observation is, it would appear that reinforced time after time like that, even a small set of insults that left me feeling continually hopeless and helpless would have a major impact on, I would have encapsulated a fair portion of my brain.
And so, what's your sense at this date?
That there's a lot less memory available now than there used to be. It's like there's a creeping closing that's going on inside my brain.
So could you speak a little bit to, just to reframe the question, is with the repetitive insults that somebody might have over and over, how one's brain, mind might congeal and possibly affect memory,
Absolutely.
affect recall, affect what else even beyond that?
Or intelligence, or problem solving, or,
Right.
you know, there's I start out oftentimes with a no, an inability to solve a problem, or a sense of inability to solve the problem.
So, first of all, let me say that a lot of what we're talking about here right now, that I'm telling you and that you're discovering for yourself, if you're looking at your own experience, I'm guessing will, at some point in the future, be proven to be totally wrong, or only partially right. Because the brain is so complex.
It is.
And like, I was talking to Tim earlier, and he was talking about how, you know, they can identify specific areas of the brain where people are having meditative experiences.
Meditative or inspirational
Inspirational
intuitional
experiences.
experiences.
Well, they can also now identify a neuron that represents a single word that you're thinking of, right?
And they call that the
Grandmother neuron. Right? So, or the
actress.
Halle Berry neuron,
Right.
or the Jennifer Aniston
That's
neuron, right?
That's true.
When you're thinking of Jennifer Aniston, there's a single neuron in your brain that's firing, right?
Only one?
Yes. Well,
Maybe one.
maybe for you,
Or something.
but at least one.
So as I hear these experiences and relate to my own, what keeps coming to mind, which has been part of the lesson for me out of my background so similar to yours, is that for me it's come around to emotions.
Right,
You know, I used to think we were intellectual beings. I'm convinced we're emotional beings.
right.
Intellect
We are.
follows. So those injuries that we participate in or that we swim in as young people are emotional states, I believe, that are created. For instance, do me physically, and so what, it hurts a little bit. Do me emotionally, and I don't forget it.
Right.
So once I came to realize that, I started to say, well then, I know, I've been studying it, you and I have the same passion. It's been the passion of my life. And I studied the hardwire part, but the emotional part keeps drawing me to it. Perhaps the fix is changing the emotion, and the physical neural pathways may follow our conscious ability and effort to change the emotion, and then the neural pathways will follow. Because when I hear
I
this
think you can join the club now. He's got-
that I relate to it, it seems to come that we're emotional beings, so maybe the fix is there, being perhaps more powerful than the physical body is.
Speak to just, and you could address this with some studies if you like, but we know all we have to do is most events are not remembered in our lifetime. The ones that are significantly magnified, hundreds of studies show that when magnified by intense emotion are much more likely to be called, remembered, embodied, capsulized, to whatever extent you want to take that. So it's not that the information of what happens isn't important, it's just that when it gets underlined, highlighted, circled, colored in, that then they rise to another occasion.
And possibly changed.
Yes, that's another one we'll get to, but
So it's really good to be able to remember things that were threatening. Because if you encounter them again, then you have some awareness that, hey, this is dangerous, I need to pay attention to that. And so one of the ways I like to think of emotion is as the brain's limited ability to process energy and information. And so anytime we're feeling emotional, it means that we have encountered an experience that in the moment we don't have the capacity to fully be present to. And so that serves as emotion. Right? And emotion has neurophysiological components. There's adrenaline, there's cortisol, there's this, the stomach tightening, the chest, the respiration pausing,
Tears.
your heart rate speeds up, the digestion stops. So there's all these neurophysiological components to an emotional experience, right? And so to begin to then try to take that, how do you know when a traumatic experience is no longer traumatic? Well, it's just a memory. You don't feel emotional about it anymore. So like the one about my sister, beating me, once I was able to process that out of my body and out of my neurophysiology, it's just, Junior Jackson grabbed me and my sister held me and beat me.
That's exactly, it's funny, after an EFT session that's been successful, it's just a retelling of the story.
Yeah,
It's like a play that you're reading, and then he did this, and she did that, and that happened, and da-da-da.
yeah.
And there's not an attachment, there's not a welling up, there's not that physiological response, it's just a narrative.
Yeah. So what we suspect is that one of the things that happens is that these formerly encapsulated neurons are now back in the network, part of the whole collection of processing capacity, right? And if you've ever had a kind of a healing therapeutic session, oftentimes you'll come out of it feeling like, wow, things are really clear, and I feel light, and I feel, or falling in love. Falling in love is a great way to get your neural capacities flowing optimally. Or taking drugs.
Oxytocin.
Is one,
Oh.
and that's one of the hormones associated with that, yeah.
And what I have found exactly along that point is when I came to realize that I actually have the power as an individual at any moment through perhaps a memory exercise that I used to take people in seminars through and bring them to the point of a joyous, happiness, loving state, and they don't realize they've come there. And then you say, now how do you feel? And you just created that in this moment all by yourself. You took yourself to that amazing place.
Yeah.
So once we realize that we can do that,
Uh-huh.
then in my mind, it's come to the pace, well, I'm kind of silly if I don't do it all the time.
Well,
Because I have the conscious ability to do it,
it's true,
even though I
and
can't.
you can actually make that a practice so that you can actually access that capacity for joy in the present moment. And there's this other piece, right? So it's the light and the shadow, right? And so the shadow is constantly playing out in the world all the time.
Could you speak to your definition of shadow, because there could be a lot of definitions. of
Well, my
what you
definition
mean.
of shadow is basically unconsciousness. Basically neurons in your brain that aren't firing, that could be to help process more than 40 bits of information in any moment. So for example, the banking mortgage crisis, right? So we have this whole swarm of people who are really excited about being able to make loans all over the place because they can make a lot of money and they can give the loans away. They don't have to fear about, their capital being, dinged for bad loans. And it's a great idea. Well, that's shadow working, because what the right brain is responsible for is being able to see the big picture, right? And trauma is where most of our memories are stored in the right brain. And there's a piece in here that I
That
really
you're not gonna show.
want to get to. It's like, if you take nothing away from this talk, it'll be, how do we do this now?
I think it was the other.
No, it's maybe nothing. Well, that's, okay. So that says the hard problem, dangerous friendships.
There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Yeah. So that's from Hamlet, and so it's not quite like that. So basically, back to this. So the right brain is responsible for seeing the big picture. If the right brain is overcome and overwhelmed with traumatic early childhood adverse experiences that don't really allow it to process as much energy and information as it might, then what we end up with is the inability to see, wow, if everybody in the country buys a house and they can't really afford it, well, that could be a problem. Right? And in hindsight, it's like, duh.
Right.
But it's in the moment, when you're in the moment, making these loans and you're really excited and, well, what could go wrong here? Right? It seems like a great idea. Everybody's getting rich.
So that makes me think,
That's a shadow.
okay. So if people have experienced many traumas, on one hand, you could have the train of thought that look at the artists that have been through a lot of pain and derive their inspiration from the pain. Somehow in seeking introspection based on that pain, that perhaps somehow that makes them more creative or introspective. Could you speak to either that myth or that idea?
Well, my sense of it, there's this pretty common notion of the suffering artist or the struggling artist. And my sense is that because trauma tends to be stored in the right brain, and art comes from that side of the brain, that in order to actually make art, oftentimes what you need to do is have this experience of going in and feeling and re-experiencing these painful adverse early experiences. So the two are, it's sort of like, it becomes really difficult to access one without the other. The problem then becomes is, like I'm thinking of Hemingway right now, who is just so overcome and overwhelmed with the pain and trauma that he'd experienced in his life that he needed relief, and so he killed himself. But he wasn't trying to, I believe this is true of all suicide people, they're not trying to kill themselves, they're trying to kill these traumatic memories that are constantly causing their neurophysiology to fire in ways that are really painful, overwhelmingly so.
I'm reading a book, Imagine, right now that speaks to the creative process, and it's often preceded by some dark introspective seeking first, like story of Bob Dylan, where he got so disappointed at all the music he was creating, just said, I'm done. I'm done. I'm not writing anymore. And in his seeking just simplicity came his next wave of his greatest work after he quit, and the frustration of press, and they go on and on, story after story of perhaps the idea of what you're speaking is that whatever the stimulus for us going into our right brain, now it can certainly also, maybe just so we don't think that's the only way to enter one's right brain is through pain and suffering. It can certainly be a conscious and aware journey as well.
And if you have an integrated brain, I mean, you can access left, right, at will.
Right.
And I think that's what a lot of Zen teachers who spent years and years essentially sitting in silence and allowing these sort of traumatic memories to surface, and then, we have the Dalai Lama here. Let's do the next one.
Yep.
Okay, so here's Seneca, who says, there are more things that frighten us than injure us, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And then Michel de Montaigne said, my life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened. So that's it. And then, let's see, here's the Dalai Lama. And what he says is that afflictive emotions, our jealousy, anger, hatred, fear, can be put to an end when you realize that these emotions are only temporary, that they always pass on like clouds in the sky. You also realize that they can ultimately be abandoned. So what he's expressing there is this sort of complete integration of left and right, where emotion comes up, left brain says, oh, it's just emotion. I don't need to be tossed away by it. If I just be present to it, it will eventually
Pass.
dissolve.
So, that brings up the next question for me is, the way you're describing this, it sounds to me like the traumas never disrupt the integrative procedure. They don't disrupt the ability of the two halves of the brain to talk to each other.
I wouldn't say it that way. I'd say many of us have diminished capacity. I certainly had diminished capacity. When I was having panic attacks, all I could do was flee for relief. That's all I knew to do. As I began, A, to understand what was happening, and then B, began to explore different kinds of, because I've been in tons of psychodynamic psychotherapy, and it was mostly not beneficial, and some of it was really harmful. But I began to discover Peter Levine's work and somatic experiencing, and worked with somatic psychology people, and began to then physically work with traumatic experiences. My sense is that actual neural fibers then began to make connections. There's this thing called the corpus callosum that joins the two halves, but there's this other thing that surrounds the corpus callosum called the anterior cingulate cortex. And that's the piece that when you have a lot of connectivity going to that, allows you then to do the process of regulating emotions. So, we feel this sense of panic and public speaking is like one of the greatest fears in the world or the country.
How are you doing with that, by the way?
But you can learn then to do the work of addressing whatever needs to be addressed, whatever surfaces. That puts more processing capacity into the network. And you begin, if you can see a picture of the brain, every picture we see, even the ones I could show you here, it's a static image, right? But this thing is like, when I think of the brain, I think of like a close-up picture of the sun. If you've ever seen a close-up picture of the sun, it's roiling, it's just constant energy and motion. Well, that's what the brain's doing, all the time, even when we're sleeping. Right?
Actually, I was just reading, just to speak on that piece, was a beautiful section in the book I'm reading. They found this unexpectedly. They had people focus on a particular task and was watching neural activity and being measured, I think, in functional MRI, as well as other ways. And then they would have them stop the activity, and there was the assumption that the brainwave activity would then dissipate and slow down and come to a plateau or a pause. And they actually found, in certain cases, surges of even greater. And they're like, what is going on between these? We call them daydreams. And they actually found that the idea of what daydreaming was often richer and more expansive in its neural activity and interconnectivity between different aspects of the brain than the focused thinking problem solving.
Right.
So that pause in between of that broiling, I like that sun image a lot. It's very much like that.
Paige, did you have a question?
Yeah, I've been roaming around this idea that comes from somatic experiencing of actually something that you described, which would be like a pruning of a self-protective response. So a kid in a situation where there's an aggressive parent, and you can't flee, you can't fight, the only thing you can do is kind of hide out. So you're pruning what would be a natural boundary setting, self-protection. And I'm beginning to think there might be a subtle difference between like pruning a self-protection and this encapsulation. And it's coming out of his question of how that would affect capacity, because it's not being encapsulated and unusable, but it is maybe saying, of all the choices this neuron has, it used to have 3, but now we're only going to use 1. So I don't know if you have an idea about what the brain is doing then.
Kind of include the question in your answer, just with volume, just in case.
Okay, so you're asking me if I think that, and I think this is what you're asking me, if I think that a trauma capsule is totally removed from the network, is that it?
No, I think that's clear. This is something that might be a little bit in between that and a neuron that's free to move. And this is this, in somatic experiencing, what we call pruning a self-protection response. So he may perceive and have the input of the receivers, but it's not in a capsule, it's just that it can't fire back the way that it wants to.
So it's inhibited or diminished its capacity, its full capacity.
Yeah, I think that would be...
I suspect that's probably something that goes on a lot. Yeah.
I mean, I would imagine, and for lack of a better word, a trauma capsule or an event that when a certain stimulus comes on, one feels like one might only have 2 ways to respond. For example, when obviously there's an infinite ways to respond, but the capacity in that moment might feel like I can either smack them or I can run, and I don't know anything in between. So in other words, I guess what I'm hearing.
Well, I'm going to read a story before we end. We'll give you another option.
Okay, all right, I'll wait for the story.
Maybe to call it a conditioned response. So how is that different than a capsule?
How is a
Like a
conditioned
conditioned
response
response, how would that be different than a capsule?
than a capsule?
Yeah.
Well, if I think about a conditioned response is basically learning, right? we have an experience, neurons fire. If it's an experience that we need to remember, then it goes from short-term memory to long-term memory and gets stored so that we can retrieve it at a later time. Right? An encapsulated traumatic experience, the only difference I would make is that it's just in my own personal experience, and as I've heard Bob talk about them, they're just not available to keep the response robust. To keep, so it's sort of like, I like the computer network analogy. So it's like if you have 16 megabytes of RAM on your computer, but you have it all tied up with all kinds of subroutines, it's going to really slow down the processing capacity. Because so much is being, so in order to keep this traumatic experience inhibited, it takes a lot of energy, right? So when you're depressed, depression is basically, diminished energy information flowing through the whole system, right? That's one definition.
Right.
I mean, it works for me. That's how I remember experiencing depression. So, so the difference between a conditioned response and an encapsulated traumatic response is how I envision it and imagine it. It's just one, it's a long story, so I won't give it to you, but basically, I think certain memories have the capacity to generalize and contribute to the flow of energy information, and other kinds don't. Other kinds really subtract from your capacity. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Let's see here. Okay, why don't we show, everybody know who this is? I'm sure somebody does.
I do.
Oh, yes, the stroke of the
Yes.
So this is
Jill Bolte.
Jill Bolte-Taylor.
Yeah.
Pretty clever the way I did that.
You did, that was swift. Was that a conditioned response or a reflective?
A learned response.
Learned response.
And practice, it's not easy making these
Yeah.
automations in PowerPoint. So I feel
What
that
is she
if any of you have seen her on the TED Talk,
I just read that.
The quote here, consciousness presents us with an altered subjective. With an altered subjective hampered with view of reality, but doesn't tell us so.
So what that means is we think we're constantly experiencing objective reality. And it's just the opposite. We're always experiencing subjective reality. Right? So this is probably, of all the things I've learned in brain science, Jill's experience, it has been really profound for me for many, many reasons. So, for those of you who don't know who she is, she's a Harvard neuroanatomist who, at the age of 38, I think, one day woke up and discovered that she was in the midst of having a stroke. Right? A blood clot formed on the left side of her brain and gradually began to impeach and intrude into her left brain's capacity to process things that the left brain generally processes, like language and numbers and speech, and so it came on her really gradually, and she didn't immediately understand what was happening. She just felt kind of strange, and then at some point, she started to get up and said, well, I have to go to work, and then she, noticed she was moving slowly, and she got on her exercise machine, and that felt strange, and then suddenly the light went off. Oh my God, I'm having a stroke. Well, when you're someone who knows the architecture of the brain really intimately, and you're having a stroke, what she did, what she thinks is funny, and I think is really funny, is that she had the opportunity to study her brain from the inside while it was failing, right? It's like, wow, this is really, and then, so she had to really make a lot of effort to do what she needed to do. It was really hard, because she didn't have the number for, she wanted to call work and tell them to send an ambulance, and she couldn't dial 911, and so she got a business card, and she's looking at these hieroglyphics, and she's trying to match the hieroglyphics on the business card with the hieroglyphics on the phone, and so she finally contacts a person that knows her at the office, and somehow he was able to deduce that, oh, she's really in trouble, and we should send somebody, and they send somebody. But here's what's really interesting about what happened to her. She was basically returned to being an infant. And part of why she had such a, as she describes it in her TED Talk, this extraordinary, glorious experience of being all right-brained without any left-brain interference, it's just, you know, it's just spacious and beautiful and gorgeous and filled with love and colors and joy. Well, part of why she had that experience is because she didn't have a whole right brain filled with trauma. She had one of the most extraordinary mothers, an extraordinary childhood education. She grew up in the Midwest. She didn't grow up in a housing project. And so she got to the hospital, they fixed her up, and what happened was her mom then came and realized, oh, this is my baby daughter. I need to do the whole process of being her mom all over again from day one. She needs to learn, you know, about everything newborns need to learn about operating and
Speech
functioning in the
and
world.
moving and-
Yeah, all that stuff. And her mom was just patient and present and grew her up again. And it took 8 years for her to be restored to what looks like full functioning capacity. So here's one thing she says in the book. I don't think she says it in any of her talks, but we're gonna look at, you know, I do this Neuropalooza thing with the Commons once a month, and we just have videos of neuroscientists come in and talk about their work, and so she's gonna be next Wednesday. There's gonna be 4 segments that she talks about her experience. But here's one thing she says, and if you take nothing away from this evening, take this away. Because this is the work of all of our lives, right? It's my work, it's your work, it's everybody's work. So here's what Jill says. She says, one of the most prominent characteristics of our left brain is its ability to weave stories. This storyteller portion of our left mind's language center is specifically designed to make sense of the world outside us based upon minimal amounts of information. So now she's realizing this as her brain's coming back online from being, you know, completely non-functional. The left brain functions by taking whatever details it has to work with and then weaves them together in the form of a story. So however minimal the details are, the brain is constantly doing this fabrication, right? And amendment and revising and adding and subtracting. Most impressively, our left brain is brilliant in its ability to make stuff up and fill in the blanks when there are gaps in its factual data. Well, after I read this, I started paying attention to all the time I walk through the world and I make stuff up. And it's like non-stop. In addition, during its process of generating a storyline, our left mind is quite the genius in its ability to manufacture alternative scenarios. And if it's a subject you really feel passionate about, either good or awful, it's particularly effective at hooking into those circuits of emotion and exhausting all the what-if possibilities. So that's basically a definition of obsession, right? We're just constantly spinning these possibilities and what if and if onlys. Okay, so here's the second piece. As my left brain language centers recovered and became functional again, I spent a lot of time observing how how my storyteller would draw conclusions based upon this minimal information. For the longest time, I found these antics of my storyteller to be rather comical. At least until I realized that my left mind full-heartedly expected the rest of my brain to believe the story that was written out. I need to remember, however, that there are enormous gaps between what I actually know and what I think I know. And I learned to be very wary of my storyteller's potential for stirring up trauma and drama. So what she's saying is that if we're having a thought and we're feeling bad, there's a high probability that our left brain, which is a bully, is doing something to try to get us to believe something that's absolutely not true.
So what do you do? Tell it to shut up?
Pardon?
Do you tell it to shut up?
Smack it around.
Well,
Smack it.
but it's doing that for a reason. It's doing that to try to protect us, right? It's spitting out all these scenarios as a way for us to be able to go through the world and pay attention and be safe, right? But we're at an age in our development where most of the time we really don't need that. Sometimes we do.
Is a story just a linear sequence of events, or does it imply causality? Is the left brain trying to fabricate causality?
All that stuff. How I think about it is anything that's not happening now that I feel threatened by. So a perfect example is I'll get an email from somebody and I'll feel the adrenaline rise. I'll feel the anger start to mount and stuff. Right? Well, that's my left brain telling me something about these symbols, these black and white letters I've seen on the screen, and where I'm sitting in my room, I'm perfectly comfortable,
Safe.
I'm safe, fed, I'm not thirsty, and yet here I am acting as if someone is trying to kill me. Right?
And you haven't even opened the email yet.
Yeah, I just looked at the subject line.
Yeah.
Where the person it's from, right?
I think of it as, you've seen like the pictograms of the words that's missing like every vowel. And you read the paragraph easily as if all that vowels were there, and you know exactly what it said, and you read the paragraph assuming that you knew what was supposed to be there, when maybe you did and maybe you didn't. And it's that ability that we see the outline of things, we fill in the details, we move here. I don't think the problem is that we do that. I think the challenge is that we don't realize that we did that, and therefore we act accordingly with those assumptions that that was so. And then of course then there's experiences when people say that wasn't what I said or meant at all. And then the challenge becomes even magnified when, as you said earlier, it turns to memory. And what we know about memory is that every time that we re-remember an event, it changes. That we re-experience not the original memory, but the last time that we thought about it memory. So the only way to have an actual memory is basically to have one here, is to go unconscious from here to here and be in a coma, wake up and then re-remember the memory that was untouched. And then it's truly as close to accurate as possible. So add the left brain story making, then add it to the altered memory and the emotions and the capsules that are evident when we remember things, and now the idea that we know what really happened is absurd, and you start to understand why the idea, for example, a police officer getting multiple perspectives, the idea that they're going to get the straight story is such a challenge.
Comedy.
So
Comedy.
this is triggering thought in me that you may not have any answer to, but I have been observing how many people now are doing the texting and on the computers and doing emails and all of this stuff, and based upon what you just said, I've had my own thought about how much miscommunication is going on because people are making assumptions based upon a few little words here or some things they you know, the emails are so notorious for people shooting stuff out without clearly thinking what they're writing. And I mean, have you seen any studies about whether or not our ability to understand communication between ourselves is diminishing because we're becoming so conditioned to use these tools that we think are wonderful tools?
There's a wonderful talk that was recently given this month actually by Sherry Turkle, MIT digital communication expert lady. And the name of the title is Facebook Making Us Feel Alone Together? And she's making that argument. She's saying because so much of our developmental time for kids is spent in digital communication, they're not having the experience of how to actually regulate their neurophysiology in the presence of other people. So that when they actually end up having to spend time in the presence of other people, they oftentimes show up as functionally autistic because they can't easily self-regulate. Right?
That's very serious.
It absolutely is very serious.
Very serious.
And as she's saying this, I'm recognizing that, you know, in other talks I've talked about how I had a traumatic experience in 7th grade with a teacher, and from 7th grade to junior year of college, I never said another word in class. I was functionally autistic, basically, as a result of that traumatic experience. So I can easily imagine that, you know, spending all this time communicating with other people, not in their presence, when we actually are confronted with real people, it's like, how do I calm myself down?
So actually, Mark, what I do want to say is out of respect for the timing of the event, it's almost 7:30. So I'd like you to close however you'd like to, and then after we close, if you'd like to stay available for a few more questions to people, then that's fine.
So how I'd like to close. I have a story from this book, and I have a bunch of books over there for anybody that's interested.
And could you also, I just want to do a plug for anybody that doesn't get the Committed Parent blog. Sundays, I very much every week look forward to Mark's wonderful blog. It's called The Committed Parent, and yet certainly not every blog post is about parenting. In fact, it's a long shot. It could be tonight's discussion, could have been several blogs. So all of them are about neurophysiology and about looking back and looking forward and how we are and how our brain works. So please do make benefit, and that's a free blog.
So the subtitle is Helping Children Raise Parents They Can Live With and They're Crazy About.
I like that.
So this is a story that some of you may have heard. It's one of my favorite stories, actually. And it's, the way I think about it is, there's a left brain here operating who's got this story they've totally made up. It's absolutely right on with its truth and its validity and its belief. And then there's the right brain, and it's got a different way of responding and interacting with this story. So I'm going to read it. It's a short one. The train clanked and rattled through the suburbs of Tokyo on a drowsy spring afternoon. Would you want to read it?
No, this is your talk.
I mean, I just know I'm doing
And it's in your book. This is your night. So.
That's not my story. Our car was comparatively empty, a few housewives with their kids in tow, some old folks going shopping. I gazed absently at the drab houses and the dusty hedgerows. At one station the doors opened, and suddenly the afternoon quiet was shattered by a man bellowing violent, incomprehensible curses. The man staggered into our car. He wore laborer's clothing. He was big, drunk, and dirty. Screaming, he swung at a woman holding a baby. The blow sent her spinning into the laps of an elderly couple. It was a miracle that the baby was unharmed. Terrified, the couple jumped up and scrambled toward the other end of the car. The laborer aimed a kick at the retreating back of the old woman with mist as she scuttled to safety. This so enraged the drunk that he grabbed a metal pole in the center of the car and tried to wrench it out of its stanchion. I could see that one of his hands was cut and bleeding. The train lurched ahead, the passengers frozen with fear. I stood up. I was young then, some 20 years ago, and in pretty good shape. I'd been putting in a solid 8 hours of Aikido training nearly every day for the past 3 years. I liked to throw and grapple. I thought I was tough. The trouble was my martial skill was untested in actual combat. As students of Aikido, we were not allowed to fight. Aikido, my teacher said again and again, is the art of reconciliation. Whoever has the mind to fight has broken his connection with the universe. If you try to dominate people, you're already defeated. We study how to resolve conflict, not how to start it. I listened to his words. I tried hard. I even went so far as to cross the street to avoid the chimpira, the pinball punks who lounged around the train stations. My forbearance exalted me. I felt both tough and holy. In my heart, however, I wanted an absolute, legitimate opportunity whereby I might save the innocent and destroy the guilty. This is it, I said to myself as I got to my feet. People are in danger. If I don't do something fast, somebody will probably get hurt. Seeing me stand up, the drunk recognized a chance to focus his rage. Aha, he roared. A foreigner. You need a lesson in Japanese manners. I held on lightly to the commuter strap overhead and gave him a slow look of disgust and dismissal. I planned to take this turkey apart, but he had to make the first move. I wanted him mad, so I pursed my lips and blew him an insolent kiss. All right, he hollered. You're going to get a lesson in Japanese manners. He gathered himself for a rush at me. A fraction of a second before he could move, someone shouted, "Hey!" It was ear-splitting. I remember the strangely joyous, lilting quality of it, as though you and a friend had been searching diligently for something and he suddenly stumbled upon it. Hey! I wheeled to my left, the drunk spun to his right. We both stared down at a little old Japanese man. He must have been well into his 70s, this tiny gentleman sitting there immaculate in his kimono. He took no notice of me, but beamed delightedly at the laborer, as though he had a most important, most welcome secret to share. Come here, he said, in easy vernacular, beckoning to the drunk. Come here and talk to me. He waved his hand lightly. The big man followed, as if on a string. He planted his feet belligerently in front of the old gentleman and roared above the clacking wheels, "Why the hell should I talk to you?" The drunk now had his back to me. If his elbow moved so much as a millimeter, I'd drop him in his socks. The old man continued to beam at the laborer. "What you been drinking?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with interest. "I've been drinking sake," the laborer bellowed back, "and it's none of your business." Flecks of spittle spattered the old man. "Oh, that's wonderful," the old man said. "Absolutely wonderful. You see, I love sake too. Every night, me and my wife, she's 76, you know, we warm up a little bottle of sake and take it out into the garden, and we sit on an old wooden bench. We watch the sun go down, and we look to see how our persimmon tree is doing. My great-grandfather planted that tree, and we worry about whether it will recover from those ice storms we had last winter. Our tree has done better than I expected, though, especially when you consider the poor quality of the soil. It's gratifying to watch when we take our sake and go out into enjoy the evening, even when it rains." He looked at the laborer, eyes twinkling. As he struggled to follow the old man's conversation, the drunk's face began to soften. Slowly he unclenched. "Yeah," he said, "I love persimmons too." His voice trailed off. "Yes," said the old man, smiling, "and I'm sure you have a wonderful wife." "No," replied the laborer, my wife died. Very gently, swaying with the motion of the train, the big man began to sob. I don't got no wife, I don't got no home, I don't got no job. I'm so ashamed of myself. Tears rolled down his cheeks, a spasm of despair rippled through his body. Now it was my turn. Standing there in my well-scrubbed youthful innocence, my make this world safe for democracy righteousness, I suddenly felt dirtier than he was. Then the train arrived at my stop. As the doors opened, I heard the old man cluck sympathetically. My, he said, that is a difficult predicament. Sit down here and tell me about it. I turned my head for one last look. The laborer was sprawled on the seat, his head in the old man's lap. The old man was softly stroking the filthy matted hair. As the train pulled away, I sat down on a bench. What I had wanted to do with muscle had been accomplished with love. So thank you. Thank you all for coming.